History, when viewed through the rose-tinted glasses of a high school textbook, is a stately procession of marble statues and noble decrees. But peel back the curtain of American heritage, and you find a chaotic backstage drama filled with hallucinations, bureaucratic failures, and decisions so baffling they border on performance art. We are not looking at the heroic montage today. We are looking at the blooper reel. From the radioactive ambition of the Cold War to the dietary habits of founding fathers, get ready to explore the fever dream that is the true American narrative. 1. The Acoustic Kitty Catastrophe. In the paranoid zenith of the 1960s, the CIA concluded that the ultimate tool for espionage against the Soviets wasn't a high-tech gadget, but a house cat. In a project dubbed Acoustic Kitty, millions of tax dollars were funneled into surgically implanting microphones into a cat's ear canal and a radio transmitter at the base of its skull. The logic? Cats are quiet, ignored, and everywhere. The reality? Cats are notoriously indifferent employees. During the very first field test in a Washington, D.C. park, the multi-million-dollar cyborg feline did exactly what any cat would do. It ignored its handlers. Instead of eavesdropping on two men on a bench, the cat wandered into the street and was immediately and lethally struck by a passing taxi. The project was unceremoniously scrapped, serving as a grim reminder that while you can weaponize an atom, you cannot unionize a tabby. 2. The 1904 Olympic Marathon of Horror. If you want a snapshot of pure distilled chaos, look no further than the 1904 St. Louis Olympic Marathon. It wasn't a race, it was a survival horror film. The course was a dust bowl that caused acute lung damage, the temperatures were soaring, and the only water available was from a dirty well. One runner, a Cuban postman, stopped to eat rotten apples and promptly took a nap mid-race due to stomach cramps. The winner, Thomas Hicks, was dragged across the finish line by his trainers while hallucinating, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of egg whites, brandy, and strychnine, essentially rat poison. Another competitor was chased a mile off course by a pack of feral dogs. It remains the only Olympic event where nearly killing the athletes was considered a valid coaching strategy, proving that early 20th century sports medicine was just guesswork and poison. 3. The Great Bat Bomb Initiative. During World War II, the U.S. military looked at the bat, a creature of the night and carrier of disease, and thought, let's strap napalm to it. The plan, championed by a dentist, naturally, involved attaching tiny incendiary devices to thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats. The idea was to release them over Japanese cities, where they would roost in the wooden eaves of buildings and simultaneously detonate, causing widespread chaos. The testing phase went spectacularly wrong in the most ironic way possible. Armed bats were accidentally released early at a testing facility in New Mexico. True to their nature, they sought shelter under the fuel tanks and barracks of the U.S. Army base. The result was an inferno that burned the entire facility to the ground. The project proved that the bats were indeed effective arsonists, just for the wrong side. 4. The Crusade Against the Ugly. In a chapter of history most civics classes conveniently skip, several American cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries enforced ugly laws. Chicago, San Francisco, and Omaha passed ordinances that effectively criminalized being physically unsightly in public. The exact wording prohibited anyone who was diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed from exposing themselves to public view under threat of fine. These laws were a cruel intersection of eugenics and classism, designed to sweep the poor and disabled out of the pristine boulevards of the Gilded Age. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a legal framework for discrimination, creating a society where existing in a non-standard body was a punishable offense. The last of these grotesque statutes wasn't officially repealed until the 1970s, a long hangover of American vanity. 5. Project A119, Nuke the Moon. In the late 1950s, the space race was heating up, and the U.S. Air Force felt insecurity creeping in. Their proposed solution to assert dominance wasn't to land a man on the moon peacefully, but to detonate a nuclear warhead on its surface. This was Project A1. The goal was purely theatrical, to create a mushroom cloud visible from Earth with the naked eye, sending a terrifying message to the Soviet Union. Scientists, including a young Carl Sagan, were tasked with calculating the expansion of dust clouds in a vacuum. Thankfully, wiser heads prevailed, realizing that irradiating our closest celestial neighbor and potentially ruining space travel forever was a high price to pay for a flexion of military muscle. But for a brief, terrifying window, the moon was on the target list. 6. The Trial of the Smiling Man. Justice is supposed to be blind, but in 1917 Montana, it was apparently humorless too. A man was arrested and charged with contempt of court for the simple act of smiling during a session. The judge viewed the facial expression not as a nervous tic or a sign of friendliness, but as a direct assault on the dignity of the legal system. This seemingly trivial anecdote highlights the rigid, almost theatrical authoritarianism of early 20th century courtrooms. In an era of war anxiety and social shifting, a smile was interpreted as subversion. The man served time for his grin, proving that in the wrong jurisdiction, happiness is a misdemeanor. 7. The Day of the Postal Baby. Before regulations tightened in 1915, the U.S. Parcel Post Service had a loophole large enough to fit a toddler, literally. Because postage was cheaper than a train ticket, some frugal parents slapped stamps on their children's jackets and mailed them to grandparents. This wasn't a metaphor. Postal workers were legally entrusted to walk or carry children along their routes. One famous case involved a 4-year-old girl named Mae Piersdorf, who was mailed from Grangeville to Lewiston, Idaho, for 53 cents. She rode in the train's mail car, officially classified as baby chicks for transit purposes. While heartwarming in a rustic way, it underscores a time when the line between human being and freight was disturbingly blurry. 8. The Invasion of Canada, again. In 1866, a group of Irish-American Civil War veterans, known as the Fenian Brotherhood, hatched a geopolitical scheme so wild it sounds like fan fiction. Their plan: invade Canada, hold it hostage, and trade it back to the British Empire in exchange for Ireland's independence. It was a logistical nightmare fueled by whiskey and nationalism. They actually managed to cross the Niagara River and capture a small fort, engaging in legitimate skirmishes with Canadian militia. The U.S. government, awkwardly standing by, eventually cut off their supply lines to avoid a massive international incident. It remains one of the few times a private army tried to use an entire unsuspecting country as a bargaining chip. 9. The Camel Corps Experiment. Before the Jeep, there was the Camel. In the 1850s, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, later of Confederate infamy, imported dozens of camels from the Middle East to patrol the arid American Southwest. The logic was sound. Camels are built for deserts, horses are not. The U.S. Camel Corps was officially born. While the animals performed admirably physically, they were a social disaster. They smelled terrible, spat at officers, and terrified the horses, causing chaos in the ranks. When the Civil War broke out, the experiment was abandoned. Some camels were sold to circuses, but others were turned loose, leading to decades of surreal sightings of wild camels wandering the deserts of Texas and Arizona, ghosts of a military experiment gone wrong. 10. The Radioactive Neighborhood. During the Manhattan Project and subsequent Cold War testing, the U.S. government didn't just simulate explosions, they simulated victims. In Tennessee and Nevada, entire doom towns were constructed. Perfect, eerie replicas of suburban neighborhoods complete with manicured lawns, furnished living rooms, and pantries stocked with canned food. The residents of these towns were mannequins, dressed in the latest fashions, arranged in dinner party tableaus, waiting to be vaporized. These tests were designed to see if a fridge could survive a nuclear blast. Spoiler, the fridge makes it, the contents do not. It brings a whole new level of darkness to the concept of the atomic family, sitting frozen in a plastic smile as the world burns. 11. The Infinite Liver Revolt. In 1943, the Pentagon faced a rebellion, but not from foreign spies. It came from its own cafeteria. The kitchen staff, perhaps getting a bulk discount, served liver so frequently that the employees reached a breaking point. The Great Liver Revolt wasn't a violent coup, but a unified, disgusted strike against the culinary monotony. It speaks to the limits of patriotism. People will sacrifice sugar, rubber, and gasoline for the war effort, but ask them to eat organ meat 5 days a week, and the fabric of society begins to tear. The menu was promptly changed, proving that even the military-industrial complex must bow to the palate of the common worker. 12. George Washington's Mouth of Horrors. The myth says wood. The reality is a Cronenberg movie. George Washington's dentures were a nightmare assemblage of hippopotamus ivory, brass screws, lead, gold wire, and, darkest of all, human teeth purchased from enslaved people. The father of the nation spent his life in excruciating oral agony, his jaw clamped shut to keep the spring-loaded contraptions from popping out. This dental disaster shaped history. Washington rarely gave speeches because talking was painful, and his stoic, tight-lipped expression on the dollar bill isn't dignity, it's the effort of holding metal springs in his mouth. It removes the marble veneer of the man and reveals the gruesome, painful reality of 18th century medical limitations. Tips. The legislative value of pie. In 1897, the Indiana House of Representatives uniquely attempted to legislate the fabric of majesty. A proposed bill, written by an amateur mathematician who believed he had squared the circle, implied that the value of pi was 3.2. The bill was intended to make math easier for students and allow the state to collect royalties on this new truth. It passed the House unanimously. It was only stopped in the Senate because a professor from Purdue University happened to be in the building and explained that you cannot legally alter a universal mathematical constant. Indiana came dangerously close to mandating that reality itself bow to bureaucratic simplification. 14. The Pig War of 1859. History hangs by a thread, or, in this case, a potato. In 1859, the U.S. and Britain nearly entered a full-scale shooting war over the San Juan Islands. The trigger? An American farmer shot a British pig that was rooting through his potato patch. The British authorities wanted to arrest the farmer. The Americans called in the military. Within weeks, warships were aiming cannons at each other and thousands of troops were digging in, all because of some bacon and tubers. It was a standoff of immense proportions over a dispute that started in a garden. Cooler heads prevailed, but for a moment, two world powers were ready to die for a pig. 15. The Poisonous Tomato Panic. For centuries, Americans viewed the tomato with the same suspicion we now view radioactive waste. Thanks to a botanical misunderstanding, tomatoes are related to deadly nightshade, and the fact that acidic tomato juice leached lead from pewter plates, people thought the fruit was lethal. They called them poison apples. The hysteria was only broken in the 1800s, when Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson famously stood on the steps of a courthouse in New Jersey and consumed a basket of tomatoes in front of a horrified crowd. They waited for him to foam at the mouth and die. When he didn't, the pizza industry was theoretically born. It is a testament to how stubborn collective ignorance can be until someone simply takes a bite. 16. The Cardboard Fortress. In 1921, military budget cuts met architectural stupidity. The U.S. Army constructed a barracks using compressed paper and a wondrous new material, cardboard. The engineers claimed it was waterproofed with a special varnish and would insulate better than wood. Then it rained. It didn't just drizzle, it poured. The fort quite literally dissolved into a soggy pile of pulp, leaving soldiers exposed to the elements and the army exposed to ridicule. It stands as the ultimate metaphor for cutting corners. If your defense strategy can be defeated by a humid afternoon, you need a new contractor. 17. The Corned Beef Smuggler. NASA emissions are calculated down to the ounce. Every item is sterilized and authorized. Yet in 1965, astronaut John Young decided the menu needed an upgrade. He smuggled a corned beef sandwich from a Florida deli into the Gemini 3 capsule inside his spacesuit. Mid-flight, he pulled it out. The problem? Breadcrumbs in zero gravity don't fall, they float. They became tiny shrapnel threatening to clog air filters and electrical instruments. The mission control transcripts capture the panic as the crew realized their lunch could crash the spacecraft. Young was reprimanded, and corned beef remains the sworn enemy of avionics to this day. 18. The Execution of Mary the Elephant. In 1916, Irwin, Tennessee became the site of one of the darkest spectacles in American history. A circus elephant named Mary, who had killed her abusive handler during a parade, was sentenced to death. But you can't handcuff an elephant, and bullets were deemed too uncertain. The solution? A railway crane. In front of a crowd of thousands, the town lynched the elephant using an industrial chain. It's a moment that feels too grotesque to be real, illustrating the mob mentality of the era. The town treated an animal with the same retributive legalism as a human criminal, resulting in a macabre image that haunts the concept of small-town justice. 19. The Miss Holstein Beauty Pageant. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco was a celebration of human achievement. The canal, the telephone, and cows. In a bizarre attempt to make agriculture sexy, the fair hosted a legitimate beauty pageant for cattle as if they were debutantes. Judges assessed the bovines not just for milk production, but for poise, personality, and physical beauty. Miss Holstein was crowned amidst cheering crowds. It reflects a specific brand of Americana where we feel compelled to put a sash and a crown on literally anything to deem it valuable. 20. The Prohibition Walgreens Boom. Prohibition didn't stop drinking, it just made it require a doctor's note. The Volstead Act had a loophole allowing whiskey to be prescribed for medicinal purposes. Suddenly, everyone in America had a mysterious ailment that only Jack Daniels could cure. Walgreens, a modest pharmacy chain, realized they were sitting on a gold mine. They stocked up on medicinal liquor and exploded from 20 stores to over 400 during the dry years. The foundation of this pharmaceutical empire wasn't built on antibiotics or aspirin, but on the legal sale of prescription booze to a thirsty nation winking at the pharmacist. 21. The Great Emu War, American Style, the Chicken Tax. While Australia fought emus, the U.S. fought poultry economics. In 1963, tensions flared not over ideology, but over cheap American chicken flooding Europe. In retaliation for European tariffs on chicken, President Lyndon B. Johnson imposed a 25% tax on potato starch, dextrin, brandy, and, crucially, light trucks. This chicken tax unintentionally destroyed the market for foreign pickup trucks in the USA. While the brandy tax was lifted, the truck tax remains. The reason VW buses and compact Japanese trucks are rare or expensive in the US today is directly traced back to a 1960s diplomatic spat over frozen drumsticks. 22. Captain America's Skeleton Censorship. In 1894, the Comstock laws were in full swing, allowing the Postal Service to seize anything deemed obscene. The definition of obscene was remarkably broad, eventually extending to anatomy textbooks. The government officially banned the mailing of illustrations showing dancing skeletons. The logic was that the depiction of the human form, even stripped of all flesh and sexual characteristic, was too suggestive for the Victorian mind. A skeleton doing a jig was apparently a gateway drug to moral decay. It highlights a puritanical hysteria where even the bones we all possess were considered NSFW. 23. The flying tank fiasco. Innovation requires failure, but the flying tank was a special kind of failure. In 1932, looking for a way to bypass trench warfare, American engineers designed a tank attached to massive glider wings or helium balloons. The theory: float over the enemy and drop into their rear lines. The reality: a tank is heavy. To make it fly, you had to strip off the armor and guns, which defeats the purpose of being a tank. Furthermore, a helium-filled tank is essentially a giant, slow-moving piñata for anti-aircraft fire. The program was scrapped when they realized they had invented the world's most expensive and least aerodynamic clay pigeon. 24. The State of Franklin. We know 50 states, but history is littered with the corpses of the failed ones. In 1784, settlers in what is now eastern Tennessee decided they didn't want to be part of North Carolina anymore. They declared independence as the State of Franklin, named after Benjamin to curry favor. They created a constitution, courts, and even a barter-based economy where deerskins and whiskey were legal tender. They petitioned Congress for statehood. Congress ghosted them. The state collapsed after 4 years of infighting and Native American raids, proving that naming your club after a celebrity doesn't guarantee entry into the VIP section. 25. Nike versus the Canon. Science is often about testing limits. In the 1970s or 80s, researchers needed to test the durability of running shoes against extreme impact forces. A treadmill wasn't enough. Their solution? Stuff the sneakers into a high-velocity air cannon and fire them at concrete walls. It paints a beautiful picture of American ingenuity. Billions of dollars in aerospace technology used to abuse footwear. While practical for data gathering, the image of Nike shoes being launched like artillery shells is a perfect metaphor for the consumerist arms race. 26. The Porch Sleeping Ban. In the 1930s, air conditioning was a luxury few possessed. In Pennsylvania, sweltering residents took to sleeping on their front porches to catch a breeze. However, a local town council passed an ordinance banning the practice. Why? Aesthetics. They argued that seeing sleeping bodies on porches looked trashy and lowered property values. It was a law that essentially criminalized surviving the heat. Residents were forced to choose between heat stroke in their bedrooms or a fine on their porch. A classic case of prioritizing curb appeal over human survival. 27. The Liberty Bells, one-hit wonder. The Liberty Bell is a national icon, revered for its connection to freedom. It is also a piece of shoddy manufacturing. The bell cracked the very first time it was rung in 1752. It wasn't worn down by centuries of use. It failed immediately upon unboxing. It had to be recast twice by local workmen, Pass and Stowe, whose names appear on the bell, but the metal formula was never quite right. We revere a defective product. The famous crack isn't a battle scar. It's a warranty claim that expired 250 years ago. 28. Andrew Jackson's double misfire. In 1835, a house painter named Richard Lawrence attempted to assassinate President Andrew Jackson. He stepped out, aimed a pistol at Jackson's chest, and pulled the trigger. Click. Misfire. Lawrence drew a second pistol. Click. Misfire again. The odds of both guns failing in that era were astronomically low. What happened next was pure Jackson. The elderly president didn't cower. He beat the assassin nearly to death with his hickory cane. Jackson had to be pulled off the shooter by his aides. The moral of the story? If you shoot at the king of the frontier, you best not miss twice. 29. The mummy medicine craze. In the 19th century, globalization brought Egyptian artifacts to America, and with them came mumia. This wasn't a curse, it was a pharmaceutical trend. Ground-up ancient mummies were sold in apothecaries as a cure-all for ailments ranging from headaches to stomach ulcers. Americans were literally eating history. The belief was that the bitumen used in embalming had healing properties. It stands as a grotesque chapter in wellness culture, cannibalizing 3,000-year-old priests because a snake oil salesman said it would cure your gout. 30. The Yale Butter Rebellion. In 1827, the students of Yale University did not riot over tuition or civil rights. They rioted over spread. The Great Butter Rebellion was sparked by the consistently rancid butter served in the dining hall. The students staged a walkout, chanting and demanding better dairy. It sounds silly, but it escalated to the point where students were expelled. It captures the essence of the collegiate experience. High-minded academic pursuit derailed by the immediate reality of terrible cafeteria food. Give us liberty or give us margarine was the subtext of the day. 31. The town that voted for a goat. Democracy allows anyone to run, but usually it implies anyone human. In 1949, the citizens of a small Nebraska town were so disillusioned with their local politicians that they launched a write-in campaign for a goat. The animal didn't win, but it garnered hundreds of votes. This wasn't just a prank. It was a scream of frustration. When voters trust livestock more than the incumbent mayor to fix the potholes, the political system has officially hit rock bottom. The goat notably had no scandals regarding zoning permits. 32. The glass harmonica hysteria. Benjamin Franklin gave us electricity and bifocals, but he also gave us the glass harmonica, an instrument made of spinning glass bowls. It produced a sound so ethereal and high-pitched that it was banned in several places. Why? People believed the sound drove both the player and the listener insane. It was the heavy metal panic of the 18th century. There were reports of people fainting, convulsing, or falling into depressive states after hearing it. The instrument was accused of summoning spirits or vibrating the brain into madness. In reality, the players might have just been getting lead poisoning from the crystal, but the legend of the demon fiddle remains. 33. The Battleship of Ice, Project Habakkuk. During World War II, steel was in short supply. The British and Americans collaborated on a fever dream called Project Habakkuk, an aircraft carrier made of pykrete, a mixture of wood pulp and ice. The plan was to build a 2,000-foot-long floating island that was torpedo-proof because, well, it was already frozen. They actually built a prototype in Canada. It took an entire summer to melt. The project was eventually canceled because the refrigeration units required to keep the ship from becoming a puddle in the Pacific were too heavy. But for a brief moment, the Allies seriously planned to sail an iceberg into Tokyo. 34. The banning of Christmas. We think of the war on Christmas as a modern cable news talking point, but in 1659 Massachusetts, it was actual law. The Puritans viewed Christmas as a rowdy, pagan-influenced excuse for drunkenness and excess. The General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony made it a criminal offense to observe any such day as Christmas. For over 20 years, celebrating December 25th could get you fined 5 shillings. There were no trees, no carols, and definitely no Santa. It was just a cold, dark Tuesday. It reminds us that the good old days of tradition were often just days of legally mandated doorness. 35. The goldfish swallowing epidemic. In 1939, a Harvard freshman named Lothrop Withington Jr. swallowed a live goldfish on a bet of $10. This singular act of stupidity sparked a nationwide collegiate craze. Suddenly, students from MIT to UCLA were competing to see who could consume the most aquatic pets. Records were set. One student swallowed 42 fish in one sitting. Animal rights groups were horrified, medical professionals were baffled, and university deans were exhausted. It was the Tide Pod Challenge of the Jazz Age, proving that the frontal cortex of the human male has not evolved significantly in the last century. 36. The self-rocking steam cradle. In 1855, the Industrial Revolution came for the nursery. An inventor patented a baby cradle attached to a steam engine. The idea was to automate the rocking process so mother could do other chores. Just picture it. A high-pressure boiler, hissing steam, and moving pistons positioned inches away from a sleeping infant. It was a ticking time bomb of scalding water and mechanical failure. Unsurprisingly, it didn't catch on, mostly because parents generally prefer their nurseries not to sound and explode like a locomotive. 37. The $100,000 bill. We fantasize about finding a briefcase full of cash, but one single bill could do the trick. In 1934, the U.S. printed a gold certificate bill worth $100,000, featuring Woodrow Wilson. These were never public currency. They were used exclusively for transfers between Federal Reserve banks. It represents money losing its meaning and becoming pure abstraction. It's a piece of paper worth a fortune, yet useless at a grocery store. If you stole one, you couldn't spend it without being immediately arrested. It is the ultimate capitalist paradox. Infinite value, zero liquidity. 38. The Great Bicycle Rebellion. In 1891, Kansas City declared war on the wheel, or rather, the town council passed Ordinance 5252, banning bicycles from city streets, citing them as a terrifying menace to horses and pedestrians. They were labeled silent killers. The cyclists didn't take this lying down. They organized a legal defense fund and staged protests. It was the first instance of a critical mass ride. The bicycle, now seen as a quaint tool of the past, was once a disruptive technology that terrified the establishment as much as AI does today. 39. The Department of De-Germanization. When WWI broke out, America gripped a frying pan of anti-German hysteria. It became unpatriotic to speak German, play Beethoven, or eat sauerkraut. In a branding pivot that rivals modern corporate disasters, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. German measles became Liberty Measles. Dachshunds became Liberty Pups. It was a linguistic purge driven by insecurity. It's comical now, but lives were ruined over it. People were tarred and feathered for not buying war bonds or for having a German accent. It shows how quickly patriotism can devolve into renaming condiments. 40. The Sewer Gator Truth. The urban legend of alligators in New York sewers is usually dismissed as fiction, but in 1935 it actually happened. A group of teenagers shoveling snow into a manhole in East Harlem spotted something moving. They lassoed and hauled up an 8-foot living alligator. It likely arrived as a baby souvenir from Florida and was flushed when it got too big, surviving on rats and garbage. While there isn't a secret civilization of reptiles down there, the fact that at least one giant predator was lurking beneath the subway grates validates every New Yorker's deep-seated fear of the underground. 41. The Vibrating Cure-All. In the late 19th century, medicine was essentially throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. One stuck invention was the steam-powered vibrator. Doctors believed that intense vibration could cure female hysteria, constipation, and fatigue. Sanatoriums installed massive vibrating chairs and beds that shook patients until their teeth rattled. It was marketed as a scientific breakthrough. Today we use massage chairs at the mall, but back then, being shaken like a paint mixer was considered the pinnacle of clinical therapy. 42. Teddy Roosevelt versus the Christmas tree. Teddy Roosevelt was a devoted conservationist. He loved trees so much he hated the idea of cutting them down for Christmas decorations. In 1902 and other years, he forbade a Christmas tree in the White House, declaring it a waste of timber. His son Archie disagreed. He smuggled a small tree into a sewing closet and decorated it in secret. It was an act of rebellion by a child against the President of the United States. Even the man who busted trusts and navigated the Amazon couldn't stop the festive determination of an 8-year-old. 43. The Shark in Kansas. If you dig deep enough in Kansas, you don't find cowboys, you find sharks. In 1938, and many times since, farmers and paleontologists uncovered fossilized teeth of the megalodon and other prehistoric sharks in the landlocked Midwest. It is a jarring reminder of deep time. The breadbasket of America was once the western interior seaway, a shallow, shark-infested ocean. When a farmer in Topeka plows his field, he is essentially scraping the bottom of an ancient sea, proving that geography is just a temporary arrangement. 44. The Monument to a Pest. Enterprise, Alabama, has the only monument in the world dedicated to an insect pest. The Boll Weevil Monument features a woman holding up a giant beetle. Why? Because the boll weevil destroyed the cotton crops in the early 20th century. This disaster forced the town to diversify away from cotton and into peanuts, which turned out to be far more profitable. The monument is a sarcastic, grateful nod to disaster. It says, "Thanks for ruining our lives so we could get rich." It's the ultimate example of finding the silver lining in an agricultural plague. 45. The cannon-firing Postal Service. Before email, there was missile mail. In 1959, the U.S. Postal Service, in a joint stunt with the Navy, loaded 3 letters into a Regulus cruise missile and fired it from a submarine towards a naval base in Florida. It landed successfully, delivering the mail at supersonic speeds. The Postmaster General declared, "Before man reaches the moon, mail will be delivered within hours by guided missiles." It never happened due to cost and the danger of nuking a neighborhood with junk mail, but for one glorious moment, the USPS was the most heavily armed delivery service on the planet. 46. The Rainmaker of San Diego. In 1915, San Diego was in a drought. The city council hired Charles Hatfield, a pluviculturist, rainmaker, who promised to fill the reservoir for $10,000 using a secret chemical mix. Hatfield set up his towers and began his work. Then the skies opened. It rained for weeks. Dams broke, houses floated away, and 20 people died in the worst flood in the city's history. Hatfield tried to collect his check. The city said the flood was an act of God, but Hatfield argued it was his chemicals. Legally, if he claimed the rain, he was liable for the damages. He fled town unpaid, leaving behind a city drowned by its own wish. 47. The Telephone Monopolies. When Rutherford B. Hayes installed the first phone in the White House in 1877, the number was simply 1. But getting a line wasn't easy. By the turn of the century, competing phone companies wouldn't connect to each other. If your butcher was on Bell and you were on a local exchange, you needed 2 different phones. Desks were cluttered with multiple handsets. It was a hardware nightmare that makes today's iPhone-Android incompatibility look trivial. It took government intervention to force a unified network, proving that left to its own devices, capitalism would have us carrying 6 different phones just to order a pizza. 48. The Great Scarecrow of Space. In a bizarre Cold War psychological operation, the U.S. considered faking the second coming of Christ over Cuba to destabilize Castro. But an equally strange plan involved projecting giant holographic images into the sky over enemy territory. Gods, demons, or just terrifying graphics. Though never deployed due to technical limitations, the military spent serious money researching how to use the sky as a projector screen. It brings up the unsettling reality that the government explored using reality itself as a weapon, turning the atmosphere into a haunted house to spook the communists. 49. The Lobster Whistle. In 1838, Iowa passed a law that required steamboat captains to blow their whistles loudly when passing towns at night. This sounds like a noise complaint waiting to happen, but the intent was to warn citizens of river pirates. However, an unintended consequence was the disruption of sleep for miles. But the weirdest maritime law might be the ones protecting lobsters in Maine, or the fact that in colonial times lobster was considered trash food fed to prisoners. There were laws limiting how often you could feed lobster to servants because it was considered cruel and unusual punishment. Oh, how the tables have turned. 50. The Unsinkable Willie. Finally, we have the story of Unsinkable Willie, or more accurately, the concept of luck. But let's pivot to a fact that encapsulates American grit. The man who fell off the Empire State Building and lived. In 1945, after a B-25 bomber crashed into the building, yes, that happened, an elevator operator named Betty Lou Oliver was injured. Rescuers put her in an elevator to send her down for medical help. But the crash had weakened the cables. The cables snapped, and she free fell 75 stories. She survived. The coiled cables at the bottom acted as a spring, and the air pressure in the shaft slowed the car. She holds the world record for the longest survived elevator fall. It is the ultimate New York story. Everything crashes, everything bursts into flames, but somehow you dust yourself off and survive the commute. The verdict. In the grand theater of human folly, these 50 files remind us that the United States wasn't built solely on high ideals and hard work. It was also constructed with duct tape, bad ideas, accidental explosions, and a significant amount of dumb luck. History isn't a straight line. It's a drunk walk through a minefield. And somehow we made it to the other side.